Can you believe that the downfall of the Western world, the complete, irreversible shattering of an empire that stood for 1,000 years, began not with a massive foreign invasion, but with a whisper, a freezing cold rumor carried across the frigid Baltic Sea, warning of a people so terrifying their very name meant the roar. Forget everything you think you know about barbarian invasions. This wasn't just a border skirmish or a transient raid for gold. This was the opening act of an apocalyptic, multi-century catastrophe no one in the gilded halls of Rome saw coming. A relentless westward pressure that would eventually turn Italy into a graveyard and redefine the map of Europe forever. This is the history of the Goths. And if you think you're going to fall asleep during this tale of betrayal, blood, and burning cities, you are gravely mistaken. To understand the sheer magnitude of the terror they represented, we have to travel back, far back, to a place shrouded in eternal twilight and myth, Gothiscanza. Imagine Scandinavia, a land locked in ice, where survival was a daily war against nature itself, a crucible that forged warriors of unparalleled ferocity and grim determination. According to their own histories, preserved later by the chronicler Jordanes, they decided one day that the ice could no longer hold them, that they were destined for warmer, richer lands. This was not a migration. It was an exodus, a displacement of an entire people led by a near mythical figure named King Beric. They packed onto 3 massive longships, a fleet destined to leave the frozen north and seek their fortune in the south, launching themselves into the unknown waters of the Baltic, a journey that would take generations, but ultimately place them right on the throat of the unsuspecting Roman Empire. They landed somewhere along the southern coast of the Baltic Sea, in what is now modern Poland, where they clashed immediately with local tribes like the Vandals, ruthlessly pushing them out and claiming the land. This was their first great act of conquest, a demonstration that these were not mere raiders, but state builders, intent on permanent settlement and absolute dominance. But the true prize, the magnet drawing them ever southward, was the dizzying wealth of the Black Sea region, the grain, the gold, the rich vineyards, and the established trade routes that defined the edge of the civilized world. This was Rome's backyard, its vital economic artery, and the Goths were marching straight towards it with the calculated efficiency of a tidal wave. By the 2nd century AD, they had completed the massive trek across Eastern Europe, arriving on the plains of what is now Ukraine, Romania, and Moldova. Here, the landscape changed them. The tight-knit tribal structure began to expand, absorbing local populations and creating a complex, terrifying military powerhouse known to archaeologists as the Cherniakov culture. It was here, on the edges of the Pontic steppe, that the Goths truly became Gothic. They split slightly into 2 massive confederations, 2 names that would forever be etched into the records of Roman defeat, the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. The difference between them wasn't immediately geographical, but political and cultural, marking the beginning of the internal friction that would both define their strength and ultimately lead to their eventual dispersal. The world was about to enter the 3rd century crisis, a period of chaos where Rome was tearing itself apart from within, cycling through 20 emperors in 50 years, plagued by civil war, plague, and economic collapse. This internal weakness was the catastrophic opening the Goths had been patiently waiting for. The moment they could finally test the supposedly impenetrable borders of the Roman state. In 238 AD, the waiting game was over. They launched their first truly massive incursion across the Danube, Rome's supposedly unbreachable northern frontier. This was the moment the Roman world officially realized that the threat they had casually dismissed as minor tribal noise was in fact an existential danger. The attack was swift, brutal, and targeted the vital Roman province of Moesia Inferior. But the Goths didn't melt away. They tasted the fear and the gold, and it only fueled their ambition. They realized that Rome was not the monolithic giant of legend, but a deeply fragile entity bleeding from 1,000 self-inflicted wounds. And the leader who would seize this moment, the man who would turn a series of raids into a full-scale war of annihilation, was yet to come. Get ready, because the true, relentless history of the Goths is about to begin, starting with the devastating campaigns of the 250s AD, the campaigns that saw entire Roman armies wiped out, emperors captured, and the very heart of the Mediterranean plunged into darkness. This is only the beginning of the end. When the smoke finally cleared from the catastrophic Gothic raids of the 250s, Rome wasn't just wounded, it was poisoned. The barbarians had tasted the richness of the Mediterranean world, and the memory of those riches was an addiction they would never shake. The Danube frontier was now a sieve, dripping blood and gold into the hands of the northern warlords, a frontier maintained only by bribery and sheer terror. But this was not a single, unified enemy. The massive migration south had stretched the Gothic people thin, settling them into 2 vast, terrifying supergroups along the Black Sea coast, the Vessi and the Greuthungi. We know them today as the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths, and their destiny was to become the twin hammers that would eventually shatter the Western world, though they did not know it yet. Imagine the sheer terror as the news reached Rome. The Goths had mastered the sea. They were no longer confined to the muddy banks of the Danube. Their stolen ships, crewed by terrifying allies like the ferocious Heruli, were sailing the Aegean like a highway of death, turning the previously safe Roman interior into a war zone. In 267 AD, the horror reached its crescendo. A massive naval force, perhaps 6,000 vessels strong, swarmed down towards Greece, a tidal wave of barbarian fury aimed directly at the sacred, ancient heart of civilization itself. They burned Athens, sacked Corinth, and left a trail of screaming desolation across the Peloponnese, proving that no sanctuary was left untouched. The greatest engagement of this entire crisis unfolded at Naissus in 268 AD. It was not a skirmish, it was a meat grinder, an apocalyptic clash of cultures designed to decide the fate of the Balkans. The legions, galvanized by pure desperation and brilliant leadership, finally managed to corner the massive Gothic horde in what became one of Rome's bloodiest victories. The stage then belonged to Aurelian, the restorer of the world, the man who understood the bitter, unavoidable truth. Sometimes, to survive, you must surrender your children. His first, most agonizing decision in the face of the deeply entrenched Gothic power was the abandonment of Dacia, the vast, resource-rich province north of the Danube River. Dacia, Trajan's mighty conquest, the symbolic jewel of Roman expansion, was deemed utterly indefensible, a costly military drain that was simply not worth the blood required to hold it. Aurelian, facing the relentless pressure from the Greuthungi, Ostrogoths, who now dominated the lands across the river, made the executive decision to pull every legion, every settler, every single Roman artifact, and the entire administration south of the Danube. This wasn't just a strategic withdrawal. It was a national humiliation, a scar burned deep into the psyche of the empire. Rome was finally admitting that it could no longer hold the line, that the barbarians had effectively annexed a territory once considered eternally Roman. The Goths had won their first permanent homeland outside of legend, claimed not by sword alone, but by exhausting the imperial machine. For the next century, a chilling, uneasy peace settled upon the northern border. This was the era of the Foederaci, the federally allied tribes, a system built on desperation and self-deception. Rome, too weak to destroy them, was forced into the horrifying position of paying its future executioners. The Goths were given massive subsidies of gold, annual allotments of grain, and vital land rights within the empire's influence, in exchange for defending the very border they once shattered. It was a catastrophic Faustian bargain, turning the enemy into a mercenary force, teaching them Roman tactics, and revealing the profound systemic weakness behind the mighty imperial facade. The Ostrogoths established a vast, powerful confederation, primarily north of the Black Sea, the archaeological Chernyakov culture, evolving from simple tribesmen into sophisticated players on the international stage. They managed vast trading networks, exchanging slaves and amber for crucial Roman silks, weapons, and manufactured goods. They developed complex political structures, unifying dozens of smaller groups under powerful, centralized kings, turning their territory into a formidable proto-state. They were the silent, brooding power of the East, massive and relatively stable, focusing on internal dominance rather than continuous raiding. Meanwhile, the Visigoths, Vesi, established themselves along the lower Danube, close enough to Rome to feel the overwhelming gravitational pull of its wealth,
yet far enough away. Meanwhile, the Visigoths, Vesi, established themselves along the lower Danube, close enough to Rome to feel the overwhelming gravitational pull of its wealth, yet far enough away to maintain their savage independence and aggressive character. They were learning the geography of the empire's weak spots, cataloging every unprotected city, every corrupt official, every military failing. This entire period, from Aurelian's retreat in the 270s to the late 4th century, was the terrifying calm before the ultimate global storm. Rome convinced itself that the crisis had passed, that they had successfully tamed the Goths by integrating them into the economy. They were terribly, fatally wrong. They were watching a coiled serpent, convinced it was a pet dog. The Goths were not settling down. They were preparing, growing stronger, refining their armies with Roman discipline and Roman weaponry. They were simply waiting for the perfect moment of Roman distraction, waiting for the one event that would break the entire known world and unleash them fully upon the South. And that event, a cataclysm nobody in Rome could possibly predict, was already galloping across the endless steppes of Central Asia, riding on the backs of small, terrifying horses, driven by the most ruthless, unstoppable warlords history had ever conceived. That shadow was the Huns, and their arrival would transform the Visigoths from uneasy neighbors into desperate refugees, slamming them directly into the empire's heart, guaranteeing the final, shattering collapse.
The arrival of the Huns was not a migration. It was an extinction event viewed through a telescope, a shuddering wave of panic that traveled faster than any Roman courier. Imagine a wall of nomadic fury, mounted on spectral horses, appearing overnight on the steppes, driven by a hunger for land and blood that defied civilized understanding.
For the Visigoths, the western branch of that great Gothic tree, led by desperate men like Fritigern, the choice was simple, yet horrific. Be annihilated by the Eastern terror that never stopped moving, or beg sanctuary from the familiar, decaying Western giant, Rome. The Danube River, that ancient, sacred boundary that had protected the empire for centuries, suddenly became the most important and terrifying crossing point in human history. The Visigothic nation, hundreds of thousands of souls, women, children, warriors, and elders, massed on the northern bank, looking south toward the supposedly invincible empire for salvation. They didn't come to conquer, they came to live, fleeing a doom they could not defeat. They sent frantic envoys across the churning waters to Emperor Valens, the ruler of the Eastern Roman Empire, stationed far away in his magnificent, indifferent city of Constantinople. Valens, a man obsessed with his own theological squabbles and the endless logistics of war, saw not a humanitarian crisis that threatened to overwhelm his state, but an unparalleled military opportunity, a gift from the gods, wrapped in desperation. He saw endless, cheap manpower, a massive supply of fresh, hardened legionaries ready to be thrown against the Persian Empire or used to crush the minor barbarians who plagued the inner provinces. The deal was struck. Perhaps the single most catastrophic bureaucratic decision ever committed in the history of the Western world. The Goths could cross, but only under the condition that they surrender every single weapon, and that their sons would be taken as hostages, guaranteeing loyalty and ensuring their subservience to the Roman yoke. It was a deal made in hell, accepted out of utter necessity. In 376 AD, a deluge of humanity, a tidal wave of fear and hope, began washing onto Roman soil. The soldiers overseeing the crossing were overwhelmed, but more dangerously for Rome, they were corrupt beyond measure, sensing an opportunity for personal enrichment. How do you truly disarm a desperate nation whose only guarantee of survival rests in the sword at their side? You can't. The Goths bribed the guards with silver, with precious furs, even with their own wives and daughters, just to keep their battle axes and their spears, the only thing that stood between them and oblivion. Rome had promised food, shelter, and land to settle. Instead, the empire delivered famine and exploitation on a biblical scale. The logistics collapsed instantly. The Roman officials, led by the despicable Count Lupicinus, began hoarding the meager grain shipments for massive personal profit. Imagine the horror. After surviving the Huns, they were dying of systematic starvation inside the Promised Land. A free Goth would trade a Roman official a handful of gold just for a single dog to eat. Imagine the horror. After surviving the Huns, they were dying of systematic starvation inside the Promised Land. A free Goth would trade a Roman official a handful of gold just for a single dog to eat. They were forced to sell their family members into slavery just to secure a crust of moldy bread, if they could even find that. The Roman supply system wasn't designed to feed an entire migrating nation the size of a small empire. The Roman administration didn't just fail, it actively preyed upon the refugees, crushing their spirit and turning their desperate hope into absolute volcanic hatred. The explosion was inevitable, a powder keg waiting for the spark. The simmering resentment boiled over into open violence near the city of Marcianople. Fritigern, the Visigothic leader, was invited to a peace banquet by Lupicinus, but it was a trap designed to decapitate the leadership. While the Goth leaders sat at the lavish table, their starving people were being massacred outside the city walls by Roman troops. Fritigern, alerted mid-meal by a frantic messenger, rose from the table, a cold, terrifying fire now set in his eyes. He didn't need to say a word. The betrayal was complete, final, and unforgivable. He and his men escaped the banquet, and the war began instantly. This was no longer a refugee crisis. It was an uprising fueled by the deepest possible injustice and the need for vengeance. The Visigoths, now joined by other desperate Gothic tribes and countless disgruntled Roman slaves who saw a chance for freedom, began a rampage across Thrace. Emperor Valens, determined to squash this humiliating rebellion and reclaim his lost honor, rushed his main armies east. Crucially, he refused to wait for the Western Emperor Gratian's reinforcements, consumed by hubris. Valens believed the Goths were disorganized rabble who could be crushed by the weight of Roman discipline alone. He was catastrophically wrong. On August 9, 378 AD, near the city of Adrianople, the fate of the Western world was decided in a single, shattering afternoon. Valens launched a premature, ill-advised attack against the main Visigothic encampment, certain of victory. The fighting was brutal, relentless, a swirling vortex of blood and iron. The Roman legions, the very symbol of eternal power, were becoming trapped, their famous discipline dissolving under the sheer pressure of desperation. Suddenly, a massive cavalry charge arrived, not just the Goths' own horsemen, but possibly reinforcements of Alans and even some Huns who had joined the revolt, slamming into the exposed Roman flank like a hammer blow. But the true horrifying climax that shook the world to its foundations, Emperor Valens himself was killed in the battle, his body vanished, never to be recovered, possibly burned in a farmhouse by the Goths, who wanted no trace of their enemy remaining. The gates of the empire were not just ripped from their hinges, they were burned to ash, leaving the civilized world exposed to the unrelenting, icy winds of the northern darkness. Rome had paid the tribute, hoping to buy peace, but what they purchased was merely a temporary silence, a dark intermission before the next, far bloodier act of the great historical horror show. They fed the beast, and the beast, now knowing the taste of imperial gold and the scent of Roman fear, grew only hungrier, stronger, and far more organized in its rapacious demands. The riches stolen from the Danubian provinces were not used to settle down and farm the land. They were used to forge better weapons, to hire faster scouts, and to refine the brutal efficiency of their war machine, turning the once mighty Danube River into nothing more than a conveyor belt for terror and conquest. The Goths were learning the logistics of destruction, adapting their tribal fury into a systemic method of dismantling civilization, brick by shattered brick. This immense, overwhelming horde, which the Romans initially viewed as a single, terrifying mass, began to differentiate, splitting into two distinct, equally lethal armies that would shape the history of Europe for centuries to come. These were the twin shadows that fell upon the map, the Tervingi and the Griunti. To the west, moving with the speed and silence of a shadow cast by the deepest, oldest forests, were the Tervingi, known sometimes as the Forest People, their leaders already starting to eye the riches of the Balkans with ruthless ambition. To the east, dominating the sprawling, terrifying emptiness of the Pontic steppes, were the Grethungi, the steppe dwellers, riders whose sheer fury and massive numbers matched the endless horizon. Their cavalry a stampede that shook the very ground of Roman influence. This was not a weakening division. It was a strategic nightmare for the crumbling empire, forcing Rome to fight two separate, coordinated, overwhelming wars simultaneously, stretching the already thin and demoralized legions past breaking point, and fracturing the defensive line entirely. Every soldier pulled to fight the Tervingi meant a gaping vulnerability exploited immediately by the Grithungi, a devastating military catch-22 that spelled doom for the frontier. Just when the empire seemed ready to slide entirely into the abyss, when the very name of Rome was synonymous with defeat and dishonor, a flicker of defiance rose from the ashes of disgrace. Enter Marcus Aurelius Claudius, a man whose sheer willpower and military competence managed to briefly halt the catastrophic momentum of the Gothic deluge. This was the emperor who would forever be known as Claudius Gothicus, and his name remains cemented in the blood-soaked annals of this conflict as the one man who, if only for a moment, made the Goths truly fear the Roman eagle again. He understood the brutal truth. Appeasement was suicide. Only absolute destruction would suffice. Claudius gathered the shattered remnants of the legions, the last true defenders of the civilized world, for one final, desperate stand against the chaotic flood of barbarian invaders who had dared to sail right into the Aegean Sea and besiege Salonika itself. He marshaled his forces, not for a defensive skirmish, but for a decisive, high-stakes confrontation that would determine the immediate survival of the entire Balkan Peninsula. The year was 268 AD, and the moment of ultimate reckoning arrived at a place forever marked by slaughter: Nisus. This was not merely a battle. It was an exorcism of Roman fear, a psychological necessity. The Goths, confident from years of effortless victories, mountains of stolen wealth, and the widespread knowledge that Roman armies were brittle and poorly led, charged headlong into a tactical masterpiece laid by Claudius. Utilizing terrain, disciplined infantry lines, and devastating cavalry maneuvers, the emperor didn't just win, he orchestrated an annihilation. The cruel hand of fate intervened with brutal efficiency. Claudius Gothicus, the man who saved the empire from immediate collapse, was stolen by the plague, a devastating illness that ensured Rome's suffering would be protracted and agonizing. His immediate successor, the iron-fisted Emperor Aurelian, inherited a stabilized, yet deeply wounded state. Aurelian was the ultimate pragmatist, a military genius who realized that simply winning battles was insufficient. The empire needed fundamental, painful restructuring to survive the long war against the northern hordes. He stared into the abyss of imperial overextension and started drawing unforgiving, harsh new borders in the dust, deciding what Rome could afford to lose and what absolutely must be held at all costs to ensure survival. This led to the most shocking decree of his reign, a psychological blow almost as damaging as any Gothic raid: the official, humiliating abandonment of the massive, resource-rich province of Dacia.
Dacia, the trophy province conquered by Trajan himself, was simply deemed militarily and economically unsustainable, too exposed, too vulnerable to the relentless tidal wave of the Tervingi and Grothumbi. Imagine the moment. The proud legions of Rome, the symbols of civilization and order, marching out, turning their backs on generations of Roman settlers, leaving them to the mercy of the very terror they were sworn to suppress. It was an admission of catastrophic weakness, a permanent scar etched onto the map of the empire, conceding vast tracts of land to the enemy. This period of relentless terror and necessary retrenchment, catalyzed almost entirely by the destructive efficiency of the Gothic threat, necessitated a radical, monstrous overhaul of the entire imperial system. The crisis demanded not just a strong general, but a bureaucratic dictator, Diocletian. He didn't just fortify the borders. He compartmentalized the entire empire, creating the monumental, agonizing system known as the Tetrarchy, 4 rulers splitting the colossal task of defense and administration. Why such extreme measures? Because the Gothic threat, along with the Persians and others, had irrevocably taught Rome that one man could no longer hold the line against the darkness gathering simultaneously on every single frontier. The Goths were the disease, and Diocletian's complex, suffocating system was the desperate, feverish immune response of a dying giant, desperately trying to survive the inevitable. Diocletian's great fever broke, leaving behind a scarred, exhausted empire. He had bought time, a mere generation of uneasy peace, but the rot he tried to cauterize was systemic, deep within the legions and the administration itself. The Goths, those phantom armies lurking across the Danube, watched this internal struggle like vultures circling a dying beast, learning, adapting, and growing stronger with every passing season of Roman infighting. But even Constantine, the Great, the unifier, could not escape the shadow of the Goths. When he finally consolidated power, the barbarians were not just attacking, they were negotiating, demanding contracts and leveraging the sheer terror they inspired to gain official status within the Roman sphere. We enter the age of the Foederati. Do you understand the cosmic horror of that single Latin word? It means allies. Rome, the eternal, the invincible, was now forced to sign treaties with the very people who had nearly extinguished her light just decades prior. The Goths were given land, often excellent land, inside the provincial borders, in exchange for military service. They were not slaves. They were not mere recruits. They were sovereign entities living inside the stomach of the beast, legally exempt from many Roman laws and taxation, but expected to fight and bleed for the emperor.
They were Rome's mercenaries, her heavy infantry, her shock troops, and Rome, in its arrogance, taught them everything. They learned the Roman legionary tactics, the discipline, the supply lines, and most importantly, they learned exactly where the imperial supply depots and defensible cities were located.
Constantine won a crushing victory over the Visigoths in 332 AD, forcing a major treaty that bound thousands of them to the empire's service. This was hailed as a triumph, a great pacification. But look closer. It was a Faustian bargain, a desperate measure that only cemented the Goths' strategic importance. They became the essential, savage shield protecting the Danube. But shields have two sides, and the shield was held by men whose loyalty was transactional, whose culture was fundamentally separate, and whose patience was finite. Rome was paying for protection, but what she was really paying for was the delay of her own execution.
And then Constantine did the unthinkable. He moved the entire capital. He abandoned the sacred hills of Rome, the seat of 1,000 years of history, and founded a new Rome, Constantinople. Why? Was it strategy? Was it ego? Or was it the chilling realization that old Rome, constantly threatened by the Germanic tribes to the north and west, was fundamentally indefensible? He moved the heart of the empire further east, away from the immediate, gnawing threat of the Danube frontier. This act was a profound admission of failure. The West was weakening, the focus shifted, and the Goths were now left in an increasingly powerful position, filling the vacuum left by the retreating imperial administration in the Balkans.
This was the age of the slow, creeping assimilation, where Gothic names began appearing on Roman military rosters with unnerving frequency. The most dangerous Goth was not the one riding across the river screaming for blood, but the one wearing the purple cloak, advising the emperor. The empire was becoming Gothicized, not through conquest, but through necessity. And as the Visigoths settled and learned, another, even more terrifying group emerged from the shadows of the Black Sea steppes, the Gruthungi, or as history remembers them, the Ostrogoths. They were the eastern branch, arguably the fiercer, the more tradition-bound. They solidified under their legendary king, Ermanaric, building a massive confederation that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. This was a true empire of barbarians, organized, disciplined, and utterly terrifying.
Ermanaric's kingdom was a geopolitical earthquake, a unified Gothic power block that stood as Rome's equal, perhaps her superior, in sheer physical might. Rome had hoped to face fractured tribes, small, manageable threats. Instead, they faced a continental power. This was not the chaotic raiding of the 3rd century. This was state-level organization, a power block that could field enormous armies and command the resources of vast territories. The Danube was now less a frontier and more a porous membrane separating two hostile worlds, the dying light of Rome and the rising, savage fury of the Goths. But even this colossal Gothic kingdom under Ermanaric was fragile, built on conquest and maintained by the sheer force of its king's terrifying will. It masked an internal weakness that Rome was too blind to exploit. The sheer mass of the Gothic population was straining the local resources, and the constant pressure of expansion required ceaseless military activity. They were a magnificent edifice built on sand, ready for the slightest tremor to bring it all crashing down.
And history, cruel mistress that she is, was preparing the greatest tremor the ancient world had ever known, a catastrophe so massive, so incomprehensible, that it would instantly redefine the relationship between Rome and the Goths forever. Imagine a silent, cold wind blowing across the vast, empty plains east of the Volga River, a sound that started as a whisper in the far distance, growing into a thunderous, apocalyptic roar.
The Roman historians barely knew their names. They were mythological creatures of destruction, appearing seemingly from nowhere, riding small, fast horses, fighting with an unnerving, silent coordination. They were the riders from the deep abyss of Asia, possessing no cities, bound by no treaties, motivated only by movement and plunder. They were the Huns, and their arrival on the European stage was not just an invasion. It was the mechanism that would instantly, violently throw the entire Gothic people right into Rome's lap.
The Goths were about to become refugees, chased by a horror greater than they had ever inflicted, fleeing straight into the heart of the empire they were meant to destroy. And Rome, in its final catastrophic blunder, was about to open the gates. The gates did open, but they did not open for a weary traveler seeking respite. They opened for a tidal wave of terror, a human avalanche that the empire had foolishly assumed it could manage with a few ledgers and a handful of border guards. It was the year 376 AD, and the entire Gothic nation, the Tervingi, led by the cunning chieftain Fritigern, stood shivering at the northern banks of the Danube, staring across the river at the promised land of Thrace. They were not invaders seeking conquest yet. They were refugees fleeing the impossible horror of the Huns, those screaming cavalrymen from the east whose arrows rained down like judgment. The fear of the Huns was the sharp knife that drove the Goths into Rome's arms, and Emperor Valens, sitting in Constantinople, saw not a catastrophic liability, but a magnificent opportunity for future tax revenue and cheap legionary fodder.
Valens, blinded by hubris and the constant need for more soldiers to fight his pointless wars against Persia, authorized the unthinkable: permit them to cross. But not all of them. Only the Tervingi were initially approved, while the Greuthungi, another massive Gothic group, were to be left screaming on the far bank, a bureaucratic oversight that would soon turn into a bloody catastrophe. The Danube became a river of nightmare. For weeks, the makeshift rafts and overcrowded boats ferried a population larger than any Roman city across the churning, unforgiving waters. Thousands died, swallowed by the current, their desperate cries muffled by the roar of the river. The crossing was less a diplomatic maneuver and more a chaotic, apocalyptic migration, utterly beyond the control of the few corrupt Roman officials assigned to manage the disaster.
These men, Lupicinus and Maximus, tribunes of the border, vultures in purple cloaks, were supposed to disarm the Goths upon entry, register them, and settle them peacefully. The first betrayal was immediate. The sheer volume of people made true disarmament impossible, but corruption made it fatal. For a bribe, a few gold coins, or even a stolen Roman relic, a Gothic warrior could keep his sword, a decision that would later cost Rome everything. The second and far more lethal betrayal was the promised sustenance. Valens had sworn to feed his new subjects until they could be properly settled. But the supply lines were non-existent, deliberately sabotaged by the greed of Lupicinus and Maximus, who saw not hungry souls, but a market they could monopolize. The Goths, stripped of their homes and their wealth, found themselves penned into temporary camps in Thrace, starving in the shadow of the richest empire the world had ever known. The price of bread, driven sky-high by the Roman officials hoarding the grain, reached levels that defied sanity. A single loaf cost 10 pounds of silver. A sack of flour required the sale of a child into slavery.
Yes, you heard that right. The most terrifying accounts from this period describe the Goths, who had once stood toe-to-toe with Roman legions, selling their own sons and daughters into bondage to buy just enough rotting meat to survive. They ate the flesh of dogs, traded the treasures of their ancestors for noxious grain, and watched their elderly and sick waste away by the thousands, all while the Roman administrators grew obscenely wealthy, just yards away.
This was the moment the Goths ceased to be refugees. This was the dark alchemy where desperation curdled into righteous, unquenchable hatred. The Goths realized they hadn't found refuge. They had walked straight into a gilded cage of exploitation, a cynical trap designed to bleed them dry of both dignity and life. Fritigern the chief watched this slow-motion genocide with burning fury. He knew the suffering of his people had to end, and that the only way to end it was to make Rome suffer far worse. The pressure built in the camps, a toxic steam ready to explode, and all it needed was a single, tiny spark. That spark was provided by the arrogant folly of Lupicinus himself. Worried about the growing unrest, the Roman general invited Fritigern and a handful of other Gothic leaders to a sumptuous, heavily guarded banquet at Marcianople under the guise of peace talks. It was a classic Roman trap. Lull them into security, then execute the leaders and decapitate the revolt before it began. But Fritigern was no fool. As the Goths sat at the lavish table, watching the Roman guards' nervous movements, news exploded outside the fortress gates. Another detachment of Gothic warriors, driven mad by hunger, had tried to enter the market and had been brutally slaughtered by the Roman forces. The air froze. Lupicinus, realizing his assassination plot was about to be overtaken by a full-scale riot, screamed orders to seize the Gothic leaders. Fritigern, displaying the ice-cold nerve that would define the next decade of warfare, stood calmly and demanded a simple explanation for the murders outside.
In the ensuing chaos, Fritigern and his commanders fought their way out of the banquet hall, miraculously escaping the trap. They vanished into the night, but they were no longer desperate refugees. They were the commanders of a vengeful army, now unleashed upon the soft, unsuspecting underbelly of the Roman Empire.
The signal was sent across Thrace. The famine was over. The negotiation was over. The Goths rose up, seizing the weapons they had bribed their way to keep. And the war was instant, brutal, and total. They poured out of their starvation camps and began to systematically burn every Roman settlement, farm, and villa within reach. The Roman legions scrambled, terrified, utterly unprepared for a war fought not for land, but for vengeance. Lupicinus desperately gathered every available soldier and marched out to crush the insurrection before it could metastasize. He met Fritigern on the plains of a place called Ad Salices, the Battle of the Willows, a name that sounds peaceful, but marked the moment the Roman military machine first tasted the true, terrifying potential of the liberated Goth. Fritigern, the refugee turned king, now controlled the vast, fertile province of Thrace. He issued a simple, chilling command. Do not destroy the cities. Do not waste time on sieges. Leave the fortified walls alone, for they will keep our enemies' supplies locked away from them. Instead, sweep the countryside clean. Destroy every farm, burn every crop, starve the enemy into submission. The Goths were learning. They were adapting, and they were marching straight toward the final cataclysmic confrontation that would define the end of the ancient world. They were marching toward Adrianople and the ultimate reckoning with the Emperor Valens himself. Adrianople was not just a battle. It was the inevitable explosion of a catastrophic political lie, a moment forged in betrayal and watered with the tears of unimaginable suffering. When the Emperor Valens permitted the desperate masses of the Thervingi Goths, fleeing the apocalyptic, earth-shattering horror of the Huns, to cross the swirling, treacherous waters of the Danube, he thought he was acquiring a vast, cheap army of mercenaries. He believed he was merely managing a complex refugee crisis, an administrative inconvenience that would quickly pay dividends. But what he was truly doing was importing a future civil war directly into the vulnerable heartland of his European provinces. The promise given to the Goths, led by the shrewd and calculating chieftain Fritigern, was simple, yet utterly hollow. Land, provisions, and protection in exchange for absolute loyalty and immediate military service. The Goths poured across the river in a state of absolute destitution, their entire survival now placed at the mercy of the vast, unforgiving bureaucratic machine of the Eastern Roman Empire, a machine already rusted, broken, and dripping with the corrosive acid of insatiable greed. They crossed not by the thousands, but by the tens of thousands,
a terrified nation displaced, their eyes wide with the terror of the unseen enemy behind them and the profound uncertainty of the future ahead. The Roman officials tasked with managing this colossal intake, men like the notorious Count Lupicinus and Maximus, saw not human beings worthy of compassion, but a walking treasury ready to be savagely plundered, and they moved with the predatory efficiency of jackals circling a wounded beast.
The supplies never, ever materialized. The mountain of promised grain, meant to sustain an entire migrating people through the winter and beyond, was instantly diverted, stolen outright, or sold back to the absolutely starving Goths at prices that would have shattered the economy of a wealthy Roman senator. This was not mere administrative incompetence. This was institutionalized, cynical cannibalism, where Roman officials systematically fattened their own coffers on the prolonged, agonizing suffering of the very people they were sworn by the gods to protect. Fritigern watched this slow, systematic, and agonizing betrayal unfold before his very eyes, his patience eroding like sand in a brutal, irreversible tidal wave. He had traded the immediate, terrifying threat of the Huns for a slow, torturous death administered by Roman indifference and boundless greed, and the incandescent fury in his heart began to coalesce into a terrifying, unified plan for absolute and total vengeance against the architects of their misery. The inevitable flashpoint came at Marcianople, the regional capital where Lupicinus, the chief Roman general in the region, decided to finalize what he thought was a foolproof trap. He brazenly invited Fritigern and the other Goth leaders to a supposed feast and serious negotiation, but the meeting was merely a thin, transparent veil for a planned assassination, a cold-blooded strategy to decapitate the burgeoning rebellion before it could even draw its first breath and threaten the Roman hegemony. But Fritigern was no fool. He possessed the instincts of a seasoned predator. He sensed the icy air of profound treachery, the heavy weight of deceit hanging in the great hall. When a sudden, violent riot erupted among his starving followers, but Fritigern was no fool. He possessed the instincts of a seasoned predator. He sensed the icy air of profound treachery, the heavy weight of deceit hanging in the great hall. When a sudden, violent riot erupted among his starving followers waiting impatiently outside the heavily fortified city gates, spurred by the arrogant refusal of Roman guards to sell them even scraps of food, Lupicinus panicked, his composure instantly shattered. Lupicinus, realizing his profound tactical mistake, had now triggered an unimaginable cataclysm, rushed his breen, inexperienced Roman legions, under-equipped, ill-fed, and utterly unprepared for the ferocity that awaited them, out to confront the mobilized Goths at a place known only to history as the Willow Trees. This was not a battle of strategy. It was an instantaneous, brutal massacre, a terrifying demonstration of Gothic ferocity fueled by months of agonizing starvation, betrayal, and unquenchable vengeance. The small Roman army was utterly annihilated within minutes. Lupicinus himself barely escaped with his life, abandoning his troops and leaving behind him a chilling trail of Roman dead, and the profound,
terrifying realization sweeping across the Balkans. The Goths were no longer desperate, starving refugees. They were now a rapidly conquering force, holding the fate of the European provinces in their blood-soaked, vengeful hands.
Valens, the self-important emperor of the East, currently campaigning in the distant, sun-scorched East against the Persians, was receiving frantic reports of an unfolding nightmare that defied belief. Entire Roman cities being systematically sacked, the rich countryside put relentlessly to the torch, and his best legions being reduced to dust by the very people he had foolishly invited across his borders. The Goths were consuming the empire from within, growing exponentially stronger with every mile they marched and every Roman army they defeated.
The stage was now irrevocably set for the ultimate, civilization-defining confrontation. Valens had to make an impossible, soul-searching choice. Abandon his eastern frontier, which had been the singular focus of his entire administrative career, or allow his European heartland to be utterly destroyed and lost forever. He chose the latter, pulling massive, battle-hardened forces from distant Mesopotamia, Syria, and Egypt, rushing them across the breadth of the empire in a desperate, last-ditch gamble to save his throne and his reputation.
He began marching toward Adrianople, not just with his own exhausted armies, but with the terrifying, suffocating weight of history upon his shoulders. His nephew, the Western Emperor Gratian, was supposed to send massive reinforcements, but Gratian was stalled by his own barbarian threats in Gaul, leaving Valens exposed, vulnerable, and dangerously impatient for glory. Valens refused to wait for Gratian's support. He saw the Goths growing in number every day, not just the Thervingi, but the Grautungi, and even Hun and Alan deserters joining the massive rebellion, all drawn to the banner of Fritigern's undeniable success. He saw an opportunity for a decisive, glorious victory, a single stroke that would instantly erase the deep shame of Lupicinus's failure and cement his own legacy forever as the savior of the East. He believed his tactical superiority, his disciplined professional legions, would crush the barbarian horde instantly and decisively. He was fatally, tragically wrong. The final, inevitable destination was Adrianople, a city of immense strategic and symbolic value, where Valens would commit the entire, fragile fate of the Eastern Roman Empire to a single, brutal, and ultimately suicidal afternoon of carnage. The drums of war were now pounding, and the very ground of Thrace was shaking violently with the thunderous approach of the largest, most enraged Gothic army the world had ever known, marching straight toward the ultimate reckoning. The reckoning was no longer a negotiation. It was a volcanic eruption of sheer, unadulterated vengeance that tore the heart out of the Balkans. The hunger that had gnawed at the bellies of the Gothic refugees, the same crippling existential hunger the greedy, parasitic Roman officials had profited from, had now calcified into an insatiable thirst for blood and justice. Lupicinus, the architect of this monstrous betrayal, believed he could simply isolate the problem, keeping the wolves penned with broken promises and inadequate rations, maintaining his profit margins even as the people under his care withered into ghosts. He was gravely, tragically mistaken. When the Goths, starving and humiliated, were forced by Roman policy to sell their own children into slavery just for rancid dog meat and a single measure of spoiled grain, the social contract that Rome foolishly believed existed instantly dissolved into ashes. That dark, horrific transaction, the literal exchange of human future for survival, became the catalyst for the entire apocalypse. The explosion began in Marcionopol, a spark ignited by sheer, terrifying desperation, but fanned by years of accumulated imperial arrogance. Fritigern, the chieftain whose name would soon be whispered in terrified prayers from the walls of Constantinople to the furthest garrisons of Gaul, saw his moment of destiny arrive with the sound of breaking chains and desperate shouts. He was no longer a desperate supplicant begging for the crumbs of civilization. He was now a revolutionary leader, wielding the focused, righteous fury of hundreds of thousands of betrayed souls. The Visigoths, initially seeking sanctuary from the terrifying, horse-borne storm of the Hunnish apocalypse, were now realizing that the supposed civilized Romans were a more immediate, calculated, and malicious evil than any nomadic horde they had fled. They tore through the countryside of Thrace like a scythe made of iron and vengeance, eliminating every vestige of Roman administration that dared stand against them, burning the villas of the wealthy exploiters, and most importantly, capturing the vast stores of food that had been so cruelly withheld from them during their months of enforced starvation. The Roman Emperor Valens, sitting fat and arrogant in Antioch, managing his eastern affairs, received reports that were so cataclysmic, so apocalyptic in their scope, that he initially dismissed them as hysterical fiction concocted by cowardly subordinates. Valens, steeped in the suffocating pride of the purple, believed he was dealing with simple, localized banditry, a minor infestation of opportunistic brigands that his legions could easily sweep away before his glorious, triumphant return from the Syrian front. He completely failed to grasp that the very demographic and military structure of the Balkans had been irrevocably altered in a single season of betrayal, and his remaining supply lines were now operating deep inside a hostile, armed, and deeply motivated enemy territory that spanned hundreds of miles. He ordered his eastern generals to proceed with extreme caution. But caution was a luxury that desperate, enraged Goths did not afford their tormentors. The first major engagement was a harbinger of doom, the Battle of the Willows, where hastily assembled Roman forces, attempting to corral Fritigern's growing army, were utterly shattered by the Goths' superior tactical deployment and the sheer, focused ferocity of their heavily armed warriors. This was not just a defeat. It was the psychological turning point where the average Roman soldier realized he was facing an enemy who fought with the terrifying zeal of the newly freed, an enemy who believed every blow struck was repayment for a starving child. The Goths, now flush with captured Roman arms, standardized armor, and vital supplies, saw the open, clear road stretching toward the greatest jewel of the region, Adrianople. This city quickly became the epicenter of the escalating crisis, a massive fortress standing defiant but increasingly isolated against the tide of Gothic vengeance. Fritigern knew better than to commit to a lengthy, resource-draining siege against fortified, well-defended walls. He needed to keep his ever-growing force mobile, hungry, and focused on a decisive, open-field confrontation that would settle the matter for all eternity. While the Visigoths tormented the region, drawing Roman forces into a deadly, exhausting game of cat and mouse, the empire scrambled desperately to coordinate a unified response from its fractured halves. The Western Emperor Gratian, a young man burdened by the immense, crushing weight of a collapsing world, was struggling to extract his armies from pressing campaigns against the restless Alemanni along the Rhine frontier. Every single day Gratian delayed his inevitable march east was another day Valens risked everything in the desperate, rapidly destabilizing east. Valens, consumed by imperial jealousy and blinding pride, could not bear the thought that his nephew, the younger, supposedly less experienced Gratian, might arrive in the nick of time and steal the final glorious credit for crushing this barbarian uprising. The Senate was clamoring in Rome, the people of the capital were panicking, and the image of the invincible Roman emperor, the inheritor of 1,000 years of glory, was dissolving rapidly into the mud and blood of Thrace. Valens saw only one path forward: instant, brutal, and solitary victory that would solidify his legacy. He consolidated every available legion, every auxiliary unit, every scrap of manpower he could rip from the eastern defenses, forming an army estimated at nearly 40,000 elite men. This was the largest, most formidable concentration of Roman military power seen in decades, but it was being assembled under the fatal shadow of crippling haste and catastrophic overconfidence. The scorching date was August 9, 378 AD, and destiny was holding its breath. The day before the inevitable battle, the air was thick, suffocatingly hot, and heavy with the scent of dried blood and imminent doom. Valens marched his legions, already exhausted and critically thirsty, across difficult, sun-baked terrain, driven by the erroneous and deliberately misleading intelligence that the Goths were few and already retreating in disarray. Fritigern, the master strategist, however, was playing a perfect masterstroke of psychological warfare and strategic deployment. He had concealed the vast majority of his terrifying Gothic cavalry force, allowing the Roman scouts to see only the slow-moving infantry and baggage trains, thereby creating the seductive illusion of a disorganized, vulnerable target ready for the taking. This was not a barbarian rabble waiting to be defeated. It was a sophisticated, perfectly set trap, expertly baited with the promise of easy victory, and sprung by the terminal arrogance of an emperor who had tragically forgotten how to fear the wrath of the desperate. The stage was set near the gates of Adrianople, the last bastion of the Eastern Empire in the region. The final messenger sent by Gratian arrived, utterly breathless, pleading with Valens to wait just a few more days, to unify their forces, to not risk the entire future of the Roman Empire on a single, hot, irreversible afternoon. Valens glanced at the message, a sneer of contempt curling his lip, and ordered the final, catastrophic advance. The fate of the West, the survival of the empire itself, and the ultimate bloody triumph of the Gothic nation rested entirely on the shoulders of the legions marching blindly into the inferno. The Goths were ready. They had endured famine, humiliation, and the terrible necessity of selling their own children. Now, they were preparing to trade Roman lives for every single indignity they had suffered. The day of reckoning was about to dawn, and the world would never, ever be the same. The earth itself seemed to hold its breath, anticipating the sound of 40,000 Romans meeting their irreversible doom.